Hello and welcome to Vendor Trash. Is the title a reference to my opinions, my drawing skills, or both? That's for you to decide. Well, here we are, fellow players. At long last, though not really that long, we've reached the end of the War Within, and so it seems only fitting that we look back at it and evaluate everything. I feel like the War Within occupies a very unique space in the catalog of WoW expansions, in that, at least at the moment, it seems to be the only one that the community kind of has lukewarm opinions on. Generally, the original trio, MoP, Legion, and Dragonflight, are seen as the good expansions. Kata, WoD, BFA, and Shadowlands are of course regarded as the bad expansions. Mind you, these are general, vocal opinions on them, not my own. I wouldn't really classify any of them as bad, but the War Within, interestingly, seems to have landed firmly in mid status, though of course time will tell how it's ultimately looked back upon. I'm not going to do a ranking here, or possibly ever, as it feels like far too convoluted a task, but I will say that it seems somewhat less complete than Dragonflight. And there are several potential reasons for that. The first, of course, is the continued push to try to roll out faster expansions, which I've made no secret about being opposed to. Sticking with something for 1.5 years is going to leave less of an impression on you than something that's here for a full 2. There's also the fact that the War Within is the opening act of the World Soul Saga, and so in many ways is not meant to be a complete package, at least on the story front. And sort of going in tandem with that is that the World Soul Saga originally was only going to be one expansion, before rewrites stretched it out over 3 expansions, with the War Within naturally being the most affected by such changes. But that's a lot of general, fairly vague commentary. Let's get into some specifics. The general gameplay, for the most part, feels very good. It pretty much always does. This shouldn't come as a surprise. Many specs and classes were getting kind of bloated. Definitely the talent trees were. But classes still play very well. Importantly, I feel like 2 systems, the Crest Upgrade and Profession/Crafted Gear system, are in a great spot. Dragonflight invented them, and the War Within fine-tuned them. It feels great almost constantly having little power upgrades that you're earning. It takes the concept of AP and perfects it, in my opinion. I did a whole video on the upgrade system. You can watch that if you want more thoughts. I put out a whole video about hero talents and how I think they're kind of silly and pointless. They're a single binary choice, supposedly rooted in class fantasy, but really, you just go either with what performs better or what feels better to play. I was genuinely shocked the concept wasn't abandoned for Midnight. At this point, I'm going to guess that they're going to let talents bloat up until the end of the saga. That'll leave us at level 100 with 4 expansions of Dragonflight talents under our belt. Probably an ideal time to do a major shakeup again. So yeah, I don't think they take away anything, but also don't feel like they add much. I'd probably have enjoyed them more if they were purely cosmetic. I do happen to like the Earthen, probably more than most players. Their personalities are a bit flat, but that's part of their charm, and really shines through with things like the Proscenium, where their bland delivery stands in stark contrast to the emotions they're attempting to convey. That being said, considering the expansion was about going to Khazalgar, by the end it didn't feel like they had all that much presence. Certainly they're felt on the Isle of Dorn, in Dornogal, and in the Ringing Deeps, as well as the 11.0 max level campaign. But after that, there's really absolutely nothing for them. Even the Drakthir, who I'm not really a fan of, had a significant story presence going through 10.1. The Earthen also, of course, feel like a waste of a playable race slot. If anything, they should have been a customization for regular dwarves. Obviously, their neutral status makes them more meaningful for Horde players, but all of the characters they associate with are from the Alliance, so that's probably where they belong. The one exception being Luthsela with Thrall. So they were fun enough, I enjoyed them more than I expected, but they're also just kind of whelming. I really like Khazalgar, more so than the Dragon Isles, I'd say. Halethal especially is, of course, ridiculously popular. There was a lot of anxiety from the player base going into the War Within that there would be underground fatigue, but I actually found the inverse to be the case. I feel like we didn't get enough of a sense of being within the earth. Part of that is, of course, Halethal being so open and well lit, not that I would change that, but there's also the fact that we kind of abandoned the premise early on. Siren Isle is of course on the surface, Undermine admittedly brings us back below, but then K'Rush is about as far away from underground as you could possibly get. And all 3 patch zones are separated by loading screens, adding to the disconnect. I feel like Herondar was originally planned for the War Within and pushed back to Midnight. And part of me thinks that's a real shame, because if there's one thing an underground expansion needs to do, it's bring us deeper and deeper and deeper. What lies even further below? That's the question that should constantly be on our minds. I wanted to end the expansion deeper than we've ever gone before. Zone variety is of course important, but I wish they weren't so scared to go all in on an idea. Northrend, by contrast, leans almost completely into being the cold north. The one real exception, Sholazar Basin, is given a very clear reason for why it breaks that rule. But I'm going to keep my thoughts on the specific zones to myself for now, because eventually I'll make it up to the dedicated zone discussion video. It's really hard to evaluate the story due to the whole trilogy thing. That's not to say WoW expansions haven't tried to connect to one another in the past, but that seemed to be more secondary to their individual stories. The War Within story felt serviceable. Nothing egregiously bad, the worst probably being stuff like Legacy of Arathor, but perhaps a bit scant feeling in total. I don't want to give it too much flack for that, yet at the same time, I hate constantly seeing the excuse that it's just part 1, wait and see. I've been told that about countless media in my life, including WoW content, and it rarely ever falls into place. Far more often, those cracks are a warning sign that things aren't actually solid. But again, there was nothing bad about the War Within story. I guess the most overt weaknesses would be that the Dark Heart is kind of a bland idea to move the plot along, and that Xal'atath's motivations are either still kind of vague or still kind of boring. Like, presumably she wants Azeroth's world soul, but why? Just to become uber powerful? Furthermore, was there any reason she had to go after the specific targets she did to fill the Dark Heart up? Obviously, Dimensius provided a whole ton of energy, but in general, wouldn't she have been better off staying away from Azeroth, filling it up on worlds that are much less poised to stop her? Also, whereas Koresh felt like a geographical departure from the expansion, Undermine felt like a narrative departure. Yes, they gave it a bit of a connection through the Black Blood and Xal'atath needing the goblins to repair the Dark Heart, but those were very minimal tethers, and Undermine was clearly doing its own thing. And that's not even a problem, really. Not every patch needs to be super tied to the main story. I shudder to think what we may have missed out on over the years if they did. I think it was definitely worth the price of narrative connectivity, but am going to point it out regardless. I feel like I'm taking crazy pills whenever I read a thread on delves and they're this universally praised feature. Some players even claim they would have quit the game if not for delves, and it just baffles me because I find them to be some of the most mind-numbing, boring content we've ever received. They're really just glorified scenarios to me, and to be fair, part of the burnout I get from them is self-inflicted. If I didn't have a compulsion to max out my brand reputation, then I wouldn't have to run like 100 of them every season. But I also see posts of players capping him and the seasonal journey like a month before I do, and like, dang, how hard are you guys going with these things? The only enjoyment they seem to bring me is from the podcasts I listen to while doing them, because it's not like I need to focus on them. Admittedly, I don't really bother going above tier 8 because the only reward for doing that are gilded crests that I can just get from running a mythic +7. The Nemesis delves are also a bit of an exception and admittedly are challenging content. I do enjoy a challenge, but will typically nope out if there isn't a reward I care about. So I only bothered to do Zekfir and Kaiveza on normal. I just don't have the twitch reflexes needed to deal with the Dark Massacres. Well, I did on normal, but it was a struggle bus. I did do Underpin on hard mode though, because the skin was great. All in all though, I had way more fun with things like Torghast, and think it's a shame that they wound up so reviled as a chore, while delves are so beloved. I am not in the least bit excited to see what delves Midnight offers, and I only hope they don't eat up cool environments that could be instead used for dungeons. But I recognize I'm in the extreme minority here. Regarding dungeons, I'm not going to go into a lot of details here because the dungeon ranking video will be coming, but broadly speaking, dungeons were pretty dang good this expansion. Dawnbreaker is still a terrible idea, but at least it's a smooth, easy experience, unlike Nokud Offensive. I'm also extremely grateful that Blizzard was willing to abandon the mega dungeon trend, which often resulted in a bunch of fluff to hit a count of 8 bosses. Operation Floodgate and Ecodome Aldani are both quite solid dungeons and seem to have emerged as fan favorites. I really enjoyed all 3 raids from this expansion, though I'm glad that Midnight will be deviating from the 8-boss raid formula. It's a good size for a raid, don't get me wrong, but not every raid should be that size. My main criticism would be Liberation of Undermine, which mostly just reused the zone for its environment. That's lame, don't do that. The Galagio was a great environment, you should have done more with that instead. I do think tuning was perhaps a bit erratic. Gallywix felt easier than Mug Z, Dimensius felt easier than Salhadar. My favorite fights across all three would probably be Kaibeza, Ovanax, Ansarek, Styx, Gallywix, Lumathar, Soul Hunters, and Dimensius. My favorite raid among the three would be Manaforge Omega. A nice environment that ties into the story well, and doesn't really have any bosses that I dread doing. Well, maybe Salhadar, just because those spike balls can be really punishing if you don't pop them all. It's also worth mentioning the Blackrock Depths raid that was active for the 20th anniversary. I have a whole video on it, but basically a whole lot of effort was put into it, and for naught. It was never going to fill the same role as a regular raid, but had it been rolled out better, it could have worked to serve the same gap-filling role that Faded and Awakened raids did. It was very appropriately themed for the expansion, and would have helped the War Within feel bulkier. Alas, it seems instead doomed to be a forgotten and pointless thing that just happened. And since I've sort of migrated into talking about patches, I feel like Siren Isle was kind of panned at the time and since forgotten about. It was, we're well aware, repurposed content that was originally made as a BFA island expedition. But personally, even though I can only credit the zone so much due to its minuscule size, I really enjoyed it. It managed to pack a lot of mysterious story elements into it, and did manage to keep us tied over until the Undermine patch. I also just like the zone itself, though I do think splitting it into a normal and stormy version was kind of tedious. I don't enjoy it here, and I don't enjoy it when they do it with phase diving for Koresh. I think Undermined was a phenomenal patch. You know, ignoring them killing off another Horde leader and everything surrounding Gazlowe and the new Goblin Way. But the environmental stuff was top notch. And while I wish the cartels were something you just picked one of and that choice mattered, I do enjoy the gameplay loop surrounding them. I see a lot of complaints about how insane of a grind they all are, especially the miscellaneous mechanical rewards, but they don't feel grindy at all to me. Just do the 3 weeklies. They take like 15 to 20 minutes a week and you get 6,000 rep. Yes, it'll take many weeks to get everything you want, but why is that a bad thing? Long-term goals, people. Dark Fuse was a bit of an exception. While I do love a long, grindy reputation, this one only felt appropriately paced with the double rep gain event active. And that's because I got the Paragon mount in one box. I'm a hardcore Paragon reward defender, but those should not be combined with mega grinds like Dark Fuse. Then we hit 11.15 and 11.17, which I like to consider the flood of filler content, and it was probably one of the most jarring bits of the expansion. For whatever reason, they were just structured as a constant barrage of micro-content that very palpably felt designed to just keep us busy until 11.2. There was the Flames Radiance reputation, everybody's favorite content Dastardly Duos, Horrific Visions Revisited, the Legacy of Arathor questline, Lore Walking, Overcharged Delves, Turbulent Timeways, the Diablo Greedy Emissary event, and catch-up events like Winds of Mysterious Fortune and Collector's Bounty. It was just a lot of things, most of which weren't very meaty on their own, but which cumulatively felt excessive, and that period of the expansion just didn't feel great to play as a result. And sadly, Collector's Bounty, my disdain for its devaluation effects notwithstanding, also caused me to have less content to do, because now I have notably less old dungeons and raids available to farm on alts. Moving on to Ghosts of Koresh, this patch admittedly didn't have the same depth and flourish that Undermine seems to have gotten, but I genuinely love it. Everything surrounding the Ethereals and the Brokers just felt so smoothly handled. It helped that most of the main cast of the patch was great. Venari was always a player favorite from Shadowlands, Xal'atath is an absolute delight to be around, and Locust Walker really emerged as a compelling character. There was still plenty to do, though it did feel a bit weird that the ecological succession quests seemed to go on far longer than the main campaign, even if the conclusion was satisfying. I guess my main complaint, as mentioned earlier, was that phase diving felt like a very tacked-on way to make things feel more expansive and take more time. Still, so much about this patch hit just right, such that my main misgiving is just that I wish we could have gotten more of it. Patches 11.25 and 11.27 also sort of just served to tide us over until midnight, but at least didn't feel nearly so much like Blizz was throwing spaghetti at a wall. The main feature of 11.2.5 was Legion Remix, which I personally didn't care for. I considered just grabbing the mounts and zone cosmetics, but decided to do more for the Sargerai Mogs, at which point I figured I might as well grab X, and Y, and yeah, the whole thing felt like a mind-numbing FOMO dopamine treadmill. Incremental rewards to keep players engaged even if it's just running through raids killing bosses in 4 seconds. Plus, as I've said before, I'm not a fan of old rewards being trivialized by being placed on a vendor for an easy to farm currency. I did enjoy having an excuse to replay the Legion story though, even if a lot of the satisfaction of filling out your class hall was just skipped over. 11.2.7 pretty much just brought back Brawler's Guild, which I managed to binge through in about a day. But you know what? I had more fun doing that than the entirety of post-questing Lemix, so I see it as an absolute win. Moving on to some more miscellaneous topics, we had Keystone Legend. I kind of hate that they added this. I feel like over the years, they've kept moving the bar of goals for M+. Originally, it was just getting Keystone Master or 2000 rating under the current system to earn a mount. Then that became normalized and the stretch goal was timing a +20, now a +10, for any given dungeon to earn a teleport. And now the stretch goal is Keystone Legend, or 3000 rating, for another mount. Now the numbers aren't that important because tuning changes every season anyway, and I still managed to do it, but it's turned M+ into more of a time investment every season. The larger issue for me is that the rewards seem flipped around. What's the point of earning the teleports if I'm going to earn them all every season anyway by doing 12s and 13s to hit 3k? I thought it was better to need to do all +7s or so for KSM, and then if I needed a specific dungeon's teleport, then I could focus on those to get a +10, and if I had all of them, then I could just relax. I hope they either ditch KSL or take off the mount reward. That's it. Rant over. I also wanted to touch on Turbo Boost. This system was kind of dumb. Yes, it feels good essentially getting a free 6 item level and everything getting consequentially easier, and it could be considered a nice surprise the first time it happened. But then it happened again in Season 3. If it's a normal thing now that we should just start expecting to happen, then it makes any effort you do before it's implemented feel kind of stupid. I mean, you'll still want to have your MythTrack gear that's limited by the weekly vault, but why try to push for a certain goal if you know it'll be that much easier in 2 months? The same applies to some of the insane rep bonuses we periodically get, and in light of all the remix stuff, even going after rare items, because eventually you'll be able to get them far, far more easily. And just in case anybody asks, I'm not going to cover housing because that's being billed very strongly as a midnight feature, and it's still fairly young anyway. So yeah, I feel like this video comes across as negative, but that just boils down to it being easier to recall and rant about things you don't like than to praise things that you were completely content with. The War Within was a very solid expansion on the whole, and, as I always do, I had fun throughout. I'd say, for me, WoW expansions are pretty much only S tier or A tier. The War Within is an A tier expansion for me, not on the level of something like Legion, but there's no shame in that. And for the player base as a whole, I think it'll go down as perhaps the middle-of-the-road X-Pack. Watch that prediction age like milk, am I right? For this week's drawing, I decided to go with Alleria Windrunner because she basically felt like the main character of the expansion. And this also completes the trio of Windrunner siblings. All 3 of them, the 3 Windrunners. The only Windrunner siblings there will ever be. And of the 3, she is definitely my least favorite. I've gone over why I'm a fan of Sylvanas a multitude of times, and I find Vereesa to just be very lovably pathetic. Alleria, by contrast, is kind of boring. I guess I do appreciate that she has the consistent character flaw of trying to do everything on her own to protect those she cares about, even when that's clearly not the right course of action. But when those flaws aren't being highlighted, she's kind of generic feeling, and as the community has endlessly pointed out, she makes a lot of dumb decisions for someone who's thousands of years old. But also, if every millennia old character acted with sage wisdom, things would get very boring very quickly, so I'll forgive that. I was a bit skeptical of her War Within redesign at first, but it's grown on me and I really appreciate that it helps differentiate her from her sisters. Although it did really throw me for a loop when I first realized the blue mark on her face wasn't a tattoo and was just face paint, which I also have to now assume is the case for her arm markings. Anyway, I know she has a prominent role in the opening act of Midnight, so I'm excited to see where that goes. And I decided to draw her in the Priory of the Sacred Flame because I didn't really know where else to draw her. And hey, Belladar at one point in time was a very iconic part of this expansion, and I don't know when else I would draw it in its void state, so let's just throw it in here. Even though it's not in its void state during the dungeon, but whatever. I have to say though, the stained glass window was really annoying to work on. Why do I do these things to myself? But that wraps up The War Within. Only 2 weeks to midnight, people. Get hyped. Thank you for watching, and I will catch you next week. Bye-bye.